The inherent iniquity in our system of money, banking and politics has not just had consequences domestically, but also on a massive scale globally. Western leaders have presented their military campaign in Iraq, Afghanistan and Pakistan as a moral obligation. But are there other reasons for it? The first financial beneficiary of America's foreign policy is the military. In particular, those who supply it with arms and equipment. The military has won wars, but how successful has it been in its bigger aim to eradicate terrorism?
The drone attacks not only failed, but they've created extra extremism. They've helped in radicalization of youth in the northwest frontier and also in certain parts of Punjab and Pakistan. And because time after time, and sometimes, there's a feeling that America does this deliberately to destabilize Pakistan. I'm not so sure about that, but I certainly think those people who actually support this policy, every time you kill 10, the so-called terrorists, you create 500 more because they see the drone attacks as an attack on a sovereign state of Pakistan.
If they really wanted to flush them out, there was no need for a huge military operation in Swat, causing the entire district to become internally displaced persons. The population of Swat is 1.8 million. There are 2.3 million refugees in the country. The whole district has been emptied. This wouldn't have been necessary if they had carried out a surgical commando operation to get the militant leaders. But they allowed them to escape, all of them.
After the military, the next financial beneficiary are those who win the contracts to conduct the rebuilding process. In the West, people might even feel optimistic when they hear that the US is pumping tens of billions of newly created dollars into developing nations to build infrastructure. But often this too doesn't seem to achieve the publicized goals. Is there another reason we give these countries aid?
We economic hitmen have created the world's first truly global empire, and we've done it primarily without the military. We work many different ways, but perhaps the most common is that we'll take a third world country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. However, the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our own corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, highways, industrial parks, things that benefit a few wealthy families in that country as well as our corporations, but don't help the majority of the people at all. They're too poor to buy electricity or drive cars on the highways. They don't have the skills to get jobs in industrial parks. But they're left holding a huge debt.
Infrastructure which has used heavy loans from the World Bank and IMF and made from grants from Western countries, they've all gone into benefiting the elite and the feudal classes. They have not benefited the people.
A lot of money goes to these consultants and companies from the West who charge huge amounts of money, and actually the real money on projects and on ordinary people is very limited. The masses have very little already. So those landlords who have the infrastructure and who are going to make money because of the infrastructure that is built through their roads, they will prosper. But the ones who don't have any resources, they've not had jobs, there isn't an economic activity for them in terms of manufacturing goods so they can sell and they can also prosper. When you don't have that, what do? They resort to joining the Taliban because they see the enemy coming in and taking away what little bit they have.
President Obama, I understand, wants to invest $7.5 billion in Pakistan's infrastructure to alleviate poverty and, take away all the divisions and all the anti-American sentiment over here. Whatever his reasons are, we can do without it. In fact, it's the worst possible thing he can do. This kind of help is actually going to be a hindrance. It's just going to make matters worse. It will bring this contrived war and terror into our rural areas.
How much of US foreign policy is genuinely altruistic? And how much is it influenced by the banks and corporations that profit so tremendously from it?
America's evangelism of democracy is riddled with contradictions, not least of which this idea of promoting democracy at the point of the gun, or opposing regimes which are democratic but not in the way that America wants. So too, this idea that America has been promoting free market capitalism has also been riddled with contradictions, because the reality is that American firms tend to make most money when countries are at the cusp of change, certainly American financial firms, and in a sense they want markets that are changing structurally, but not too free and too transparent, because they make money when markets are a bit opaque.
Is it any wonder developed nations are fighting in underdeveloped countries when so many are making so much money out of it, without ever really having to face up to or even witness the consequences of their actions?
So what if 5 million kids died in Africa because of debt last year? I got a bonus of £1 million, and if I have that conversation, I've had it with some bankers who've been in the business a long time, and they listen politely, very polite, very charming, and at the end they say, "Well, Tariq, it's lovely meeting you again," and they go back to the office and do another loan deal for Tanzania or something.
I've known a lot of terrorists, quote unquote. I've met them, I've interviewed them for books, I've known them since I was an economic hip, and I've never met one who wanted to be a terrorist. They all want to be with their families back on the farm. They're driven to terrorism because they've lost the farm. It's been inundated with water from a hydroelectric project or with oil from oil derricks. Their farm's been destroyed. They can't make a living for their kids. Or in the case of the Somali pirates, their fishing waters have been destroyed. And that's why they've turned to this. It isn't because they want to be pirates or terrorists. Now, there may be a few crazy people. There are a few crazy people with their nuts loose. There'll always be serial killers. There'll always be crazy people. Maybe Osama bin Laden is one of them. But they do not get a following unless there's a terrible injustice going on. And people are starving and they're deprived. And then they will follow these crazy people because they seem to offer an alternative. If we want to do away with terrorism, if we want to have what we in the United States call homeland security, we've got to recognize that the whole planet is our homeland.
What does the word terrorist actually mean? Many terrorists would sooner describe themselves as freedom fighters. Could it be that the charge of terrorism could just as easily be made against Western corporations, speculators and policymakers?
When we talk about terrorism, it means what they do to us, not what we do to them. And what they do to us can be pretty ugly, although it's not even a fraction of what we do to them. I mean, take, say, 9/11. That was a pretty serious act of terrorism, maybe the worst single act of terrorism in history. But it could have been worse. I mean, suppose, for example, that Al-Qaeda had bombed Washington, bombed the White House. It killed the president, installed a harsh military dictatorship, brought in a bunch of economists who drove the economy into its worst disaster in history. Well, that would have been worse than 9/11. And I'm not making it up. It happened. What's called the first 9/11 in South America, namely in Chile.
On the 11th of September 1973, the democratically elected Chilean president Salvador Allende was overthrown in a coup. A dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet was established that ruled Chile until 1990. There was the systematic suppression of all political dissidents. Thousands were imprisoned and murdered.
Who was involved in that first 9/11? It's not hard to find them. Right in Washington and London and so on. But that's off the agenda. That doesn't count. There's a principle of ideology that we must never look at our own crimes. We should, on the other hand, exult in the crimes of others and in our own nobility in opposing them.
The root causes of so-called terrorism will not be solved by increasing economic inequality. If governments really are serious about combating terrorism, then they must start with real structural reform back home. As long as banking empires chase infrastructure and debt deals in pursuit of profit, the West will continue to export injustice through finance. Millions more will be displaced, terrorism will thrive, and neo-colonialism will continue to end more and more lives around the world.